condiciones económicas que ya conocemos, con una situación social muy difícil, y que en Europa, específicamente en Gran Bretaña, es imposible de que esto ocurra. Y hace algunos años, cuando yo decidí hablar públicamente de mi caso, para las personas que no lo conocen, hace ya 15 años yo fui secuestrada, torturada y violada cuando hacía una investigación periodística, y en todos estos años he tratado de entender esto, de por qué en medio de los conflictos los combatientes se ensañan con los cuerpos de las mujeres. Y haciendo un análisis sobre el tema, me encontré que no solamente eran los combatientes, que lo que pasaba en las casas, y no solamente en las casas, en los hogares de América Latina, sino en todos los hogares del mundo, estaba relacionado directamente con la vulnerabilidad de las mujeres, y que en países europeos muy desarrollados el problema tenía unas dimensiones que eran incalculables. Y en tu país ocurre mucho. Hay una violencia intrafamiliar, una violencia en el hogar muy marcada. ¿Cómo una mujer europea, una mujer que puede tener mejores condiciones, o que tiene mejores condiciones que las que pueda tener una mujer en África o en América Latina, se decide hablar? ¿Qué es lo que ha sido el punto de quiebre para que las mujeres digan: yo no voy a silenciarme más frente al atropello que tengo en mi casa?
Well, I think that part of the reason why many women have been speaking out in the UK particularly is because there is a sense that this problem has been solved there. So there is often a sense that women don't experience these problems in Europe, for example, when in reality, in England and Wales alone, in my country, 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence. 1 in 2 disabled women will experience domestic violence. 1 in 5 women is the victim of a sexual offence. 85,000 women are raped every year, and 2 women every week are killed by a current or former partner. So I think that one thing that's important to acknowledge, and there was a sense of frustration around perhaps, is that these issues are happening everywhere. There is no country in the world that has dealt with the problem of violence against women or the problem of gender inequality. And I think and I hope that what we've found is that there is a worldwide surge of women everywhere standing up and speaking out about these issues, and about how they affect them, and about how they manifest themselves within their local communities. For me, what was very important was not about me personally standing up or trying to kind of become a figurehead for any of this. It was very much about creating a platform for women's voices to tell their stories in their own words. And I hope that that's what we've achieved, that this is very much about the voices of women, and of women all over the world, speaking up in their own way, in their own communities, and being able to use those stories and the strength that comes from the solidarity that comes from speaking out to try and create change, and to try and tackle this stigma that exists everywhere against survivors of sexual violence, against survivors of these experiences. And through what I've been doing, I've been working with a US-based organisation called Women Under Siege that works specifically on the use of rape within conflict zones, as you mentioned, specifically sexual violence that takes place in conflict, and looking again there at how the reason that that kind of thing is so effective is because of the stigma that exists against survivors afterwards, because it's such an effective tool, and for so long it wasn't acknowledged as a tool. It was seen as collateral damage, when in reality it is very much used as a targeted and deliberate weapon. And part of the reason it is so effective as a weapon is because the stigma against survivors afterwards is very effective in disrupting communities, because women who have been raped around the world often are stigmatized, rejected afterwards, and that results in societal breakdown. So I think for me, although of course there are very clear particular issues happening in particular individual countries, there is also a massive universal problem here, which is not just about the fact that domestic violence and sexual violence and gender inequality are happening all over the world, but also that they are rooted everywhere in the idea of women as second-class citizens, in the idea that it's somehow shameful to speak out, in the idea that women's voices shouldn't be listened to and don't have value and currency, and that women as some value, that their value lies somehow in this idea that they're objects that can be somehow ruined or thrown away. So I think it is a universal problem, and I think that there is a very exciting sense of the feminist movement worldwide now, with women in different countries standing up and tackling what's happening, but also that there is a sense of connection and solidarity across borders, that we are able to support women in different countries and to advance together towards that shared goal.
Hablas del silencio. Ahora estamos hablando un poco de eso, ¿no? Del miedo a hablar sobre este tipo de temas, pero sobre todo la vergüenza, admitir que en algún momento se ha sido víctima de algún tipo de violencia de género causa eso, vergüenza. Es un estigma social, decir que de pronto en mi casa hay violencia intrafamiliar, que mi padre en algún momento ha golpeado a mi madre, o que soy acosada por alguno de mis hermanos o por algún familiar o por alguien cercano a mi círculo familiar, y el hablar tal vez es lo más difícil. Y en Colombia hay un silencio del 86%. En general, el tema de violencia sexual y de violencia de género alcanza una cifra de 86% de silenciamiento por parte de las víctimas. Las mujeres no quieren hablar, pero además está ligado al tema de la impunidad, porque en Colombia tenemos una impunidad del 98% en casos de violencia sexual. Y eso lleva a que las mujeres no quieran hablar. ¿Cómo romper el silencio? A mí me tomó 9 años decidir contar públicamente lo que había ocurrido y dar la cara y decir: yo soy una mujer que tiene el cuerpo marcado, que fui violada por 3 hombres, que fui torturada, y eso trae unas consecuencias fuertes, personales y públicas. Y algunas personas, digamos, manejan mejor el tema de dar la cara públicamente. Pero ¿cómo hacemos para empoderar a las mujeres, para empoderar a todas estas jovencitas que han sido acosadas o que han sido víctimas de algún tipo de violencia? ¿Cómo rompemos el silencio?
Well, I think it's hugely important that what we're not saying here is that we're demanding something of victims. This is not about suggesting that there is any single duty or any right or wrong response to experiencing sexual violence, gender inequality, sexual harassment. I think what we need to do is we need to look at the reasons why victims feel unable to speak out. Because there is societal stigma, because we wrongly in society focus on victims, we blame victims. When we hear that a woman has been raped or sexually assaulted, we see articles in the newspaper asking what was she wearing, what was she drinking. We hear people discussing the case, talking about her sexual history as if that has any bearing on the case. And I think what's really important is that there's also a huge amount of distrust in the authorities. There are women who have very good reason not to feel able to come forward. There are women who try to come forward and tell their story and are not believed. We have a rate of 26% in the UK of women who come forward with experiences of rape and they're not recorded as crimes. I think that there is a massive problem both structurally and society. So for me, this is not about saying you have a responsibility as a woman who's experienced something like this to speak out. Rather, I hope that we can focus on changing that narrative and creating a society in which speaking out would not be so stigmatized, and that these things go hand in hand. And I think that part of that change has to be about shifting societal stigma and changing the way that we react to and the way that we speak about these cases. And that might mean targeting the authorities, actually, targeting the way that these cases are dealt with, targeting the media when rape cases are reported in a way that seems to be titillating or to confer blame on the survivor, and actually making sure that we're taking those barriers out of victims' way in order that we might create an environment within which it is easier to come forward. But if people do feel able to share their stories, then I think we can also try and find innovative ways to create platforms for them, because it is often survivor stories in their own words that can be the most powerful antidote to some of these problems. And that's why Everyday Sexism exists as a very specific kind of platform. You don't identify yourself on Everyday Sexism. Often women may use a first name, or often they'll use a pseudonym. There's no photograph, there are no contact details, there is no way for anybody to reply to you, to write underneath, nothing. It's very, very simply, this is my experience. And we're then able to take those stories and to take them offline and use them to try and create the change that we need to see within the community. So we have a situation where women are able to tell their stories, and those stories are being used to create change, but those women don't necessarily have to go through the experience of their face and their identity being publicly attached to them. And I think that can be very important, particularly when women fear retribution for coming forward. So as an example, we had a huge number of stories on everyday sexism from women who had experienced sexual assaults on public transport. So on the tube or the bus, women who had been followed, who'd been harassed, who'd had men assaulting them, they'd had men masturbating in front of them, and we knew from the British Transport Police that 95% of these cases were never reported to the police. So they weren't being dealt with, the problem wasn't being tackled. So we were able to take the stories and we went to the British Transport Police with them and we broke them down and explained not only this is what's happening, but this is why women are saying they don't feel able to come forward. They don't think they'll be taken seriously. They're afraid that they won't be believed. They don't even realise they have the right to protest because even though these are sexual assaults, they've become so normalised. And the police used that information and those women's stories in their own words to retrain 2,000 of their officers. And then they went out and they did a campaign which was reaching out to people and saying, we will take this seriously, this is illegal, you can report it, you can have confidence in us. But in order for those women to come forward and share their stories, what first had to be done was that the police had to be trained always to believe the victim, to take the minor things seriously. And it's now resulted in a 35% increase in the reporting of sexual offences on public transport across London, and also, crucially, a 35% increase in perpetrators being caught. So I think it's important that this isn't about saying to victims, why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you speaking out? It's about looking at society and the reasons they feel unable to and trying to tackle those problems first, I think.